Welcome. My name is Donna Oser, and I am the president and CEO of the Michigan Society of Association Executives. Very, very pleased to be able to spend time with you today and hopefully connect you and further you on your career path as you pursue your certification in association management. Very exciting. While you're working through your names, I'm going to encourage my panelists to introduce themselves. Wendy, would you mind getting us started?
Not at all. I'm Wendy Kavanaugh, CAE. I've been the president of the Georgia Society of Association Executives for 16 years now.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Wendy. Wendy, one of the things that goes on in Georgia is you've got some really robust study groups, right?
Absolutely. I just noticed that my two current chairs are on today, and hopefully they will respond in chat when I say something off what they would like me to say.
Add some support. Perfect. So Mark, I think if you would introduce yourself, that would be fantastic. And I know that you have some preparation programs in your state as well.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Mark McSweeney. I am the executive director for the Indiana Society of Association Executives, as well as the Association Societies Alliance, which sounds much more impressive than, well, it is very impressive. It's the association of all of the SAEs, like MSAE and GSAE and ISA and all of us. It's our group, proving once again there's an association for everything. But yes, we do have, Indiana has we do a study session, a study group twice a year, spring and fall. We always start at about 6 weeks prior to the exam. So we've obviously been doing them online the past couple, and we'll do it online again now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that you were able to join us today. And last but certainly not least, Sue, if you would introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Sue Rodwan. I am the lead instructor for the programs that are sponsored by the Michigan Society of Association Executives. I've been teaching CAE courses for the last 25 years. I'm the lead developer of the online programs that we have available through MSAE. And we currently offer 3 different types of courses for students that are offered each test rotation period. So I do 6 classes at least a year in this curriculum. And additionally, I am the executive editor of the Professional Practices and Association Management handbook for both the 3rd edition and the 4th edition, which is the textbook that you all are using as you pursue CAE.
Especially that 4th edition, right? As people are clamoring to get a copy of it right now.
The one that we're waiting for, and the one that's available on Kindle right now. And it's a really great book.
Yeah, so we'll have you talk more about that later, Sue. Appreciate the fact that you made time on your very busy schedule to join us. Let me just share some context with our participants today so that they know what to expect. So we're grateful that you've joined us. Our plan is to get the ball rolling by just kind of taking the panelists through some of the common questions that we get related to CAE. While we're transitioning into those questions, we'd encourage you to share where you're at right now. Where are you joining us from? So for example, I happen to be joining you from East Lansing, Michigan. That's where our offices are. I got to say go green, right? Because I'm a Spartan, right? So if you'll share kind of where you're joining us from in the chat, city, state, and maybe whether it's your dining room or an office or whatever, that would be great.
You might need to go country as well, Donna, because we have some folks from Australia and New Zealand here.
I heard that we might have a few join us from New Zealand, so that is fantastic. So while you're doing that, we're going to get started with some of these questions. Now know that about halfway through, we're going to be switching over and starting to take some questions from audience participants. So those of you who are participating, don't hesitate. If you have a question, go ahead and type it into the chat. That way you don't forget it. We'll make sure we get to it. If we can't get it during our allotted time today, know that we're going to follow up with you via email. Make sure that you have a copy of the video of this session and also any of the resources that are going to be shared in the chat. Now that's important because I would like you to know that many of the other state societies are joining us via chat. So I appreciate that they're with us today, and we have encouraged them to help support you via the chat as well. So if you put a question out there, you're going to have a lot of expertise really at your fingertips responding to you. Pursuing your CAE is certainly a daunting challenge, but you just have a great advantage today in that you have a lot of experienced, knowledgeable people who can give you some information on that. Okay, so let's cut right to questions. And so let me start off by, Wendy, I'm going to start with you and ask, so tell us about what value you have found personally in pursuing your CAE.
So I have 3 C's. For me, it was certainly, I pursued the CAE when I realized that association management was going to be my career. I started with an English degree from the University of Georgia in the middle of one of the previous recessions. And so I was hired as a newsletter editor and was gifted with the best supervisor ever, who introduced me to GSAE's community, introduced me to association management as a profession. So, you know, less than 10 years in though, into that part of my career, realizing that it was my career and not just being a newsletter editor or being an administrator of shared interest groups. The second piece was the credibility piece. I had less than 10 years experience and I was opening my own association management company as a sole proprietor with 3 clients. And I really felt that having the CAE would give me the credibility with my new boards of directors, which I had not been a CEO at that point. And so that was one. And then the cohort that I developed through my study group experience, just invaluable. They are still people, even after, you know, back in 2002, that I still reach out to. And for those of us that have been through, you know, future leaders programs or leadership academies, or various and other things, a CAE study group really did give me that first impression and first experience with cohorts.
Thank you. That's very insightful. It's right. The people you do your CAE with are the people that you have relationships with for a very long time. Mark, what about you? What value have you found in your CAE?
Oh, a couple different things that I noted on that. One is exposure to, I'll say, the ideal practices out there. I'm specifically not saying best practices, because best practices can be all over the map for people, but kind of the ideal practices and exposure to all of that, both through the reading and studying to get ready for it, plus the stuff you continue doing to maintain it. The other, or another, is frankly marketability of the profession itself and myself as a professional. I have had some of my jobs that specifically, I know I'm here because I had those 3 letters at the end of my name. And they recognize the value in not only achieving the credential, but what it meant to maintain it. And on that end, in terms of maintaining it, it's the encouragement for continual improvement that by maintaining it, I say forces me, because I actually enjoy the learning process, but it does encourage me to just remain fresh and keep doing things and keep trying things year after year that otherwise I might get stale. I've been doing this for 30 years and I still am amazed at how much I do not know.
Mark, I can't believe they let you work when you were 5. That is such a shame.
Seriously,
We're going to talk about that offline. I will second what you said, and that is that I pursued and attained my CAE in 2005, and I still say it is definitely hands down the best professional development I have ever done in association management in all those years. Okay, thank you for sharing. So I'm gonna shift gears now and ask sort of this question, which I bet a lot of our participants are thinking, and that is this. Sue, I'm coming to you with this question to start, which is, how does someone know if they're ready to pursue their CAE in earnest?
Pursuing CAE, I mean, it is a journey, first of all. So you got to recognize that. And the question is, when are you ready to start the journey? And the journey actually starts with a planning of how you're going to get 100 hours of education. It doesn't happen automatically. You have to be intentional about it. So you make that choice early in the journey, and then plan how you're going to get those 100 hours. So your journey might start 5 years before you even begin to think about studying for the actual exam. But as Wendy suggested, when you decide that this is your profession, this is who you want to be and where you want to be, that would be an indicator that this is something that you want to pursue. I will say that, you know, the pursuit of the CAE, it's like pursuing a master's degree in association management. And you are going after mastery as you are preparing for the exam, and it requires a very different way of thinking than you might have as a staff specialist. So you got to give yourself enough time to adjust and to understand what that new way of thinking is. And it takes some time to integrate that. So this is not something that you decide to do 2 months before the exam. You really want to plan your journey, and it truly is a journey about you and who you want to be in the profession.
Thank you. So while you were speaking, I did share with the group, and I'll share again, just sort of that worksheet that ASAE makes available so they can kind of plan. But Wendy, would you speak to that? So thinking about yourself, but also thinking about so many of the candidates that you talk to, how do they know when they're ready?
It is a combination of everything Sue and I mentioned earlier about committing to the career. But also you have folks that are ambitious and are lifelong learners and you know, are looking for any certificate program that gets them further along in their professional journey. So I also want to recognize that our corporate supplier partners who are pursuing it, you know, pursuing the CAE when you're a supplier of goods and services to the community, that makes you understand associations and your clients better. So I think there are several factors that go into it, but it is not something that you should go into lightly because it is a time commitment. It is a process. There is a mastery that's expected from it.
Absolutely. So we're going to build on that because there's this other question. So, you know, obviously Michigan, Sue mentioned, you know, we've got CAE programs running nearly year round when you consider the two groups of three. And so in following up in communications and talking with participants, like one of the things that I see often is they get into it and then they're overwhelmed by other factors in their lives. And so talk a little bit about what other factors, you know, both professionally and personally should people be considering, you know, before they fill out that application to take their exam. Mark, why don't you speak to that? And then I'll go to Sue after that.
Preparing for the exam, preparing for the credential is in fact time consuming. And Sue said it well, that it is a journey and you need to prepare for that. The good news is once you earn it, quite frankly, maintaining it is a breeze. It's a piece of cake. But those initial 100 hours, whether it's just the tenure of time you need, that can be quite a bit. But particularly once you actually get it actively studying for the exam, preparing for the exam. You know, when we have candidates going through our program, one of the first things we'll talk about is the fact that, you know, you look around the room virtually or in person and you say, you know, when's the last time you took a 200 question multiple choice exam? And for most of us, it's been a minute or two. That whole process it can become overwhelming, to your point. So you do want to make sure you've got the time to dedicate toward the preparation for it. So yeah, the family, your other job, things you have going on. If I've got a major event coming up, you know, this spring, maybe May is not the time for me to really try and sit and do this. Maybe I want to put it off till December instead. So I think you do need to figure all those things out, your family, your other obligations you have in life, but don't let those be a permanent obstacle either. Don't let that be the excuse to keep putting it off. All candor, I did that for a long time. I kept finding the excuse, oh, I don't have time for all of that. And I just kept putting it off. And you find at some point, if it's important, to the point that both Sue and Wendy made, if this is going to be your career and your job, whether it's you doing this work or you supporting this work, it's the right thing for you to do.
Thank you. I think you covered that well. So let's just talk about timing here. So in thinking about how much time should someone give to pursuing their CAE, both for reading and studying? And I'm going to ask Sue to answer this question and then Wendy to kind of round it out. Okay.
Okay. So there's a lot of reading. I mean, the professional practices, a book itself is over 600 pages. Plus, if you add in if you want to read the law handbook and other supplementary stuff, there's a lot of reading. So we recommend that you should plan on reading, just reading alone. This doesn't include study groups or anything like that, but reading at least 6.5 to 8 hours a week. And with that kind of effort, you will have read enough. You probably won't have read everything, but you will have read enough to be able to manage, the content. So that's a lot right there. And in recognizing that, with the 6.5 to 8 hours a week, and then plus you've got study groups or, courses, virtual touch points. Those are all things that, and then, if you take any sample exams, that's all extra time. So it is a long haul. I do think a lot of people do, like one domain a week as they lead up to the exam. I think that's really overwhelming. I think you need more time than that to kind of stretch out the reading a bit. So in our classes, we have a full class that's a 16-week class. And, some of the domains that are more heavily, more heavy reading have a couple of weeks to get it done. And then we have a class where it's one domain a week. And I feel really bad for those people because it's just so much. And it's like, you can't live the rest of your life if you're trying to read that much. So you really want to think about how you approach it. You could start reading materials before you start taking a class. And I'm thinking that, particularly with that 6 weeks that Mark has, you've got to be pretty well read before you even get there. So you want to set up, again, this is part of the journey. How do you organize yourself so that you can manage that reading load? I often get complaints, can you lessen the reading? This is too much reading. And it's like, if you're going to be an excellent exec, an excellent CSE, chief staff executive, you've got to be a reader, because that's what keeps you in front of everything else. That's what keeps you on top of your game. And if you're not a reader, there are other ways. There are, you can listen to podcasts, you can listen to videos or watch videos. There are some other supports in the environment, but it does not replace you absorbing that information yourself through all of your senses. And so that's all I got to say about that.
Wendy, would you like to add to that?
Sure. I did poll my current and past chairs of our study groups and ask about that time period prep question. Generally speaking, they both came in at 6 to 12 months. And again, recognizing what Sue said about the reading that needs to happen before you even get down to the hardcore studying piece of it. What we recognize as well for GSAE candidates, you need to plan your time really well. You need to know, as Mark mentioned, if you have a big conference in the middle of your study planning session, you need to account for that and to double up the next week possibly. We found that a lot of our candidates also use the study group framework as a way to manage their time of setting aside dedicated time for it. And it, again, all three of us will say over and over again, this is not something you just wake up one day and say, I think I'm gonna sit for the exam. You really do, and we can help you plan out that process, but it is not just an instantaneous, if I devote two hours a week to it. My folks are talking about 6 to 8 hours, depending on, how you manage your time.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Hey, Donna, if I could, I want to just come back to something because Sue just reminded me of when she was talking. Just to make sure everyone's clear, when I talk about ISAE's 6-week study group, if you're coming into that 6 weeks out, just starting the process, no, that's never going to work. That's not the intent of our study group. Our study group is to bring people together who have already gotten to that point and are now we're going through practice exams and we're talking about the testing itself and getting your brain prepared for that, not the content.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. So for attendees, who are kind of looking and perhaps planning their journey and thinking about what kind of supports they're going to, maybe a study group, whatever. I mean, they want to make sure that before they sign up for something that they understand what's the expectation of that group, because, I know Sue would probably speak to this. I don't know, we don't need to spend a ton of time on it, but some of our courses presume that you are already pretty well informed on some things, to where the full course, right, we're assuming that we're going to kind of go soup to nuts and do a deeper dive on those. So just to make some connections. So I've shared in the chat the list of resources that ASAE says are the CAE kind of core resources. Now that's a pretty comprehensive list. So really quick, you get to pick one. I'm going to ask each of you, what would you say is the absolute essential text? And once one person says it, the next person does not need to repeat it. Okay, so we're going to get 3 different resources out of this. Okay, I'm going to go, Mark, you first. What do you say is essential reading and preparing for CAE? Can't do without it.
The Professional Practices and Association Management, the main textbook.
Absolutely. Sue, what would you add to that?
Membership Essentials.
Very good.
Second
and how about the second
Yep.
edition? Yeah, okay. And Wendy, how about you? What would you add?
I already put it in the chat, the law book. I literally every time, and of course I'm GSAE, so we're getting the reference materials as they're updated. I look at that law book all the time and literally say, okay, this is when you need to consult the attorney that you're going to go and retain. This is what the law book says about the case law. It is essential for me. And actually, the fact that I didn't have it in my home office 2 weeks ago, I had to go get it.
Right. So I think that leads to an interesting point. I know that sometimes CAE candidates are frustrated by the cost, and we've received a couple questions in the chat about cost, and we'll give the detail, and follow up with them. But when people look at purchasing the resources, they can seem like they're expensive when we're talking about the PAM book, the law book. But Wendy's point, I think, is important to note that as an association professional, these are the kind of resources you want to have on hand. So even if you weren't taking your CAE, you would be referring to these texts because they really encapsulate sort of that body of knowledge of what an association professional executive really needs to have on hand. So that's a good point. Okay, well, thank you for that. So I am going to ask you this. This is another kind of cost versus value question, right? So one of you mentioned earlier that in preparing for CAE, you have to have 100 hours of CAE related professional development. Now that can seem pretty daunting. And my perception in renewing my CAE, every 3 years since 2005, is that ASAE's kind of tightened the belt on what they'll include. So in other words, a lot of my professional development, I used to get like with my work-alike groups nationally, that kind of thing. I used to get credit for it. Now it's much more difficult to get credit from ASAE for those. So my question to you is, for these folks who are looking at how many hours they have so far and what they still need to get, what is the kind of programming that you recommend that they get that's going to help them prepare for the exam while also earning credits and, of course, improving their knowledge about association management? Let's start with Sue and then we'll go to Mark.
So if you're early in the process, I would take a look at what the content outline is. That's posted on the ASAE website, and choose coursework, choose workshops that are in areas that you don't work in, but you need some familiarity with as it relates to the CAE exam. That will give you a heads up and get you start you thinking in ways that perhaps are different than you might. So like if you're the membership director and all you do is membership workshops, that's not going to help you. You need to be broad-based, a broad exposure to the association world. So if your organization is willing to pay for some education for you, really look at how can I broaden my knowledge base and maybe tie it into membership, or but that's one thing. The second thing I would suggest to you is that you can take exam prep courses, but you need those courses are count for a lot of hours. Our courses are around 30 hours, 28, 30 hours or so. but you have to finish all of your hours before you actually submit your application. So that might mean for some people, you take the course, say in the spring, and then you don't take the exam until the fall. So that you finish the whole course, you get 30 hours, you're on that path, you've been exposed to all of the content, and then you have your own internal study process to lead you into the December exam. So that way, those hours can do double duty for you.
Yeah, that's a good point. Mark, what would you say as far as
Well, I
recommendations?
mean, in addition to that, I think that's spot on in terms of what I initially would have said. I think if you look at those the eight domains that are out there as that content guide and the sub pieces underneath that, that's going to give you kind of a good overview of what's important, what you need to know, and to Sue's point, what you don't know. But the other thing I would suggest is that the time can seem daunting. Yes, it doesn't have to be overly expensive. I mean, in terms of the classes, there are plenty of free and low cost courses out there that you can take through. I'll do a shameless plug for all the SAEs out there. Most of us all have them. Not to mention our annual conferences or other workshops that we all do and everybody has access to. You can pick up, to Sue's point, a lot of hours attending a 1 or 2 or 3 day conference. And if it's your own SAE doing it, hopefully it's relatively local for you, so you're not spending an arm and a leg just to get there. There's online options as well. A good chunk of us participate with Seminar Web. There's 1 hour quick pickup things you can do there as well. So there's lots of opportunities if you just reach out there and look at it. We just did I'm not going to call her out because I know she's actually on this right now, but somebody I work with here that is prepping for her exam in December, and we had to she has plenty of tenure experience. That wasn't the issue. It was the actual CAE coursework that she needed to get taken care of. And so we did some creative looking over the past few months for her to get the remaining hours she needs to get in by September so she can take the exam in December. And initially we thought, oh, there's no way. And then we started looking at it and said, yep, you know what? You can pull this off. And I mean, we're able to support her to do it, but it's doable. It really is. And it doesn't have to cost you thousands to get it done.
Yeah. So just to sort of round that out, and we'll include these in kind of our webinar notes today for folks, but what is it? Wild Apricot publishes they compile all of the free webinars that are available every month in their blog. Not all of those get CAE hours, but many of them. I send candidates to that all the time. Now, sometimes candidates get frustrated because they don't want to look to see, for each one to see if they get CAE credit. But I mean, it's kind of like the cost benefit, right? Like either you're going to go a route that's very clear. And like Mark is saying, there's a whole chunk of hours that you're able to get through conferences and kind of virtual programs. It sounds like Georgia has an academy, Michigan has an academy. Those tend to be larger blocks. They're kind of pre-preparation programs. But if you're going to do kind of one by one and build them that way, then you're going to have to do a little elbow grease to sort out who offers credit and who doesn't. Wendy?
I was just going to say, Donna, Deirdre Reed also publishes on Facebook every week the free association brain food programs that are out there. But the other thing I was going to point out from a planning perspective, an Excel file can be your absolute best friend. You take a class, you dump it in. So many of the SAEs on the state, local, and regional, we're tracking our members' hours for them and can provide a CSV file at any point in time, or they can go to their own profile and pull it down. ASAE tracks those kind of programming hours. So making sure that you're paying attention, do an auto sum at the end of the spreadsheet, so you know exactly where you are in that path to getting those 100 hours. The other thing that I was going to mention, again, those kind of bulk programming options like the Institute of Organizational Management. I mean, I have so many candidates whose companies have paid for that. And it's a ton of hours over 4 years. So really be on the lookout for those kind of free, low cost, but also the opportunities to maximize and use your spreadsheets. just stay organized. I've also had candidates that had, 30 more hours than they needed because, oh, I just looked at it.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
just
and
be cognizant of it.
And of course, master's credits really count heavily on the application. So if any of you folks have just recently finished up, your master's, then you're going to find that you're not going to need a lot of extra for that reason. Sue, I think you wanted to comment on this as well.
Yeah, so one of the things that the CAE exam is, it's how do you think? It is not how you do. So when you are choosing education hours, it's one thing to get to accumulate hours, and you can just throw a lot of stuff in there. But if you want to be intentional about content that will really help you with CAE, look at courses that help you think, critical thinking courses that are related to association management, because it is the thinking that is examined on this exam. Then you're not going to get a question of how do you do a renewal. It is
Right.
much more about what is the strategic positioning of retention in an association. So you've got to be thinking from that really big picture space. So if all of your education is how to do stuff, that's not necessarily going to be the best prep.
Excellent. That's a good point. So for those participants know that kind of related to that, we just Sue created, we just prettied it up a bit, that 12 steps to thinking through a CAE question. And so I think that infographic really illustrates how you have to think through these questions. But I also think as an association executive, it's informing you how you should be thinking through real problems in your organization, right? As well. So I think that tool has kind of a dual benefit. So we're getting lots of questions that we're going to get to in the chat here shortly. But before we shift over to that, let's just talk about kind of the realities of as you think about the candidates that you've interacted with and maybe your own experience as well, what would you say are the most common pitfalls that you've seen with regard to preparation for the CAE?
I'm happy to take a stab at that one.
Okay.
I will not only stab it, I will kill it. So where I think the biggest issue, there are two. One of them is how you study. As you read, we generally tend to read that which proves we're right. So you start reading professional practices and you say, oh, we do that, and we do that. Oh, yeah, we were good. But the issue is you got to see what's there that's different than what you do, because that's where best practices are really living. And so it requires a different kind of study, different kind of reading than just skimming or just looking for certain kinds of information. The second thing that I think is really is a challenge for so many. As I said, this is a thinking exam, and it requires a particular kind of thinking that I refer to as systems thinking. Many people who are staff specialists are analytical thinkers. You do project management and you look at from end to end, all the steps that need to happen, and everything's very sequential and very logical, and it's all about the project itself. But the reality is that as a CSE, every decision you make needs to think about the strategic positioning of that particular project in the whole of the organization. So if you come into this exam thinking like a staff specialist, you will not do well, because you're thinking too narrowly. You're thinking about just the project rather than the position of the project among the whole of the organization. The third piece about that is that when you are actually taking this exam, it really is, you want to jump into implementation. And all of the questions, about 99% of the exam is a judgment question. It's not a factoid. So you have to be able to apply judgment to each of the questions. And where a lot of people go wrong is you just go to the implementation thing, and that's not going to be the right answer. It is about this rule of thumb that you hopefully learn about, the SPY rule of thumb, the scan, plan, implement, evaluate. that when you are looking at an exam question, you need to first scan and understand the context for the situation. And I believe it's never, ever about the project that's in the scenario. It's about the relationships, about the perspective, it's about the strategic positioning of that thing that you have to put into your thinking. And that's why the systems thinking is the most important, where the whole of the organization is your primary concern as the chief staff executive. And where people go wrong is they forget that that's what it's about. So one of the things that I believe very, very clearly, I have my little helicopter here. You have to be in the helicopter mode in order to do well on this exam. You cannot think about what you do in your organization. That will kill you, because every organization we do workarounds, but for the CAE exam, as Mark mentioned, you got to know the ideal. What would the ideal do? Now, we all know that the ideal doesn't really exist, but for the purposes of the CAE exam, you have to answer the questions in terms of the ideal and the strategic positioning of all of the scenarios that you're presented with.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about. So obviously, as they'll watch the video again and be like, what did she say? Processing all that. That's very technical. So let's shift now and just, I want to ask Mark and Wendy, what do you see as just sort of the more kind of basic preparation problems that when you talk to candidates, you realize that they've gotten hung up on or fallen prey to? Mark?
I'll tell you that the number one frustration I get in our study groups from people, and when we're going over the practice exams and things like that, and questions that have tripped them up, is that very much to what Sue just went through, but it's their inability to separate reality from theory. And whether it's the helicopter view that Sue is, whatever your metaphor is for it, but it's that your perspective, the perspective of this exam, is that you are a CEO from a large association. Doesn't mean you have limitless resources, but you have more than most of us typically deal with on a daily basis. So the reality of how we deal with any given situation, any scenario that's presented to us in the exam, is probably not going to be the answer to the question, because as was already said, there are in reality, day to day, there are workarounds, there are things we do, there are sensible shortcuts sometimes that we take, but it's still good to know what is the ideal. And that's what this test tests to. And the people that, in my experience, get hung up are the ones that they forget that and they get sucked into, but that's not what we do in my organization. No, but that's not the question. And once they get there, eventually it's great. At some point, they start our study session off scared and overwhelmed. Then about halfway through it, they're just at a max frustration point because they're just pissed off at these practice tests. And then a light bulb finally goes off. We just stay on it. And sure enough, a light bulb goes off and they get, you're right. As soon as I looked at it from that perspective, it changed the entire outlook of the exam form.
Yeah, that's insightful. And that's why doing those practice tests and really doing question analysis and leaning into understanding when you get a question wrong, why did you get it wrong? Where was the flaw in your thinking, right? Is so critical. Wendy, did you want to add any just kind of common pitfalls that you've seen before we move off of this topic?
I was absolutely going to echo what you just said, that it's as important to know why you got something right as it is to know why something else is wrong in that answer structure. And so we certainly, my volunteers spend a lot of time talking about why you got something wrong and helping to shift that thinking, as Mark mentioned. The other thing that we see people falling into, we do a lot of encouragement of the self-assessments, taking those Wily tests, taking any test you can get your hand on. And some are more flawed than others. Let's be frank. I mean, we don't have access to the questions that ASAE and the commission are using. So therefore we're doing our best with what we know. But you can't fall into the habit of memorizing those right answers on, you know, not falling into that pit of, I've seen this question 18 million times, I know the answer to it. Well, that may be a question that got thrown out 4 years ago, and they've updated it and upgraded it, and it's going to feel familiar to you on the test, but it's not the same question. And so really trying to, again, focusing in on what Sue says about flexing your critical thinking muscle and not just relying on a familiarity or a memorization.
Don, I want to just add one more thing.
Sure.
So when people don't pass the exam, it's not unusual that they don't pass the area of the exam that is their specialty. And so for instance, it's not unusual for lobbyists who to not pass the advocacy domain. And part of that is because you assume that you know it all because this is what you do every day, but you don't recognize that there are best practices, and what you do are the workarounds. So it is not unusual at all. And there's just been huge heartache from people who, you know, have what they, you know, a specialty practice inside the association world, and they don't pass that part of their exam.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for people to realize that people fail this exam. It happens, and they have to retake it, and that's not the end of the world. Right? That, you know, having an open mind and being resilient, I think, is important instead of letting this one score defeat you, right? It's more about what's your plan of attack to come back after it and be successful, especially if you have test anxiety. I mean, I can't tell you how many people I talk to who I think their anxiety is their biggest issue, right? And now that testing is kind of happening differently, we'll talk about that in a second, but I think that can certainly complicate things. So let's just, before we get to testing, let's just talk real quick about the application process. Now, I want to be clear for those who are listening that, you know, ASAE is the credentialing entity. So specific questions about those applications, I strongly encourage the people to email ASAE with questions. If you email them a specific question, then you have a written response, right? So you have that in hand, you know, later on when you're submitting your application. But that being said, and I think, Wendy, this certainly relates to, so you mentioned earlier, like, hey, make sure that, you know, an Excel file or a Google spreadsheet is your best friend for just getting organized. But what other advice might you guys have for candidates just about the application process itself?
I would simply underscore, and don't put that off, that piece that Wendy's talking about, whatever tracking document you use, we're similar. We track stuff that people do here in Indiana, but it's just what you do through ISAE. I don't know what you do outside of it. And ASAE may do the stuff you do through them. But if you just get into that habit of doing it now, that, in my experience, is the most time consuming part of the application, is pulling together 100 hours worth of CAE credit. So if you have to be digging through old files and old registration forms and calling people and asking people, that'll take you a long time and frustrate you. I would just start it now, and then it's easy.
Yeah, good point. Sue?
Yeah, I would, if you are taking any courses, say from attorneys, you know, other people outside of the SAE world, one way to be more sure that you will get credit for it is to, as you put in your application, the description of the course, use the language from the competency that it's related to, rather than just putting a title. You really have to connect the dots for the people that are reviewing your application. So you need to tell them how this is related directly to the app or to the content outline.
Right. And I know that many organizations have gotten away from kind of the paper program, but it never hurts to just keep a file that, whether it's paper programs or electronic programs that you've downloaded, right? That way you have it to refer to. And if they question it, you can say, oh no, you know, here's the fullness of the information. Just to kind of, ASAE once questioned a conference that I had on my application for renewal. And fortunately I had the agenda where Reggie Henry was presenting. So when their own staff member was presenting it, you know, it got me out of hot water, but I was glad that I had saved that for sure. Okay, so that's very helpful. So let's, we just have like 2 more questions, and then we're going to go to audience questions, and they've got some really good ones. But we have to talk about the test, right? So testing is different for folks who may not have been following this for many years. couple of things have happened that are significant changes in the ASAE world. So really two test cycles ago now, they switched to an online assessment instead of a paper assessment, right? So just, I got that right, December of 20 was the first time going online, right? And then of course the content outline changed thereafter, right? So then we have the, no, same time?
No. Content outline change moving into the December 20 exam.
Okay, so both of those were the first time.
Yes.
Thank you, Sue. And so that means there's a difference in how the test is delivered, but also the test content itself is different. So there's a lot going on in that space. So let's just talk about how it's delivered. So right now, after people apply and are approved, they need to make a choice, right? And the choice is whether they're going to go to a center, a Scantron center, and actually take the test in the center online. And in this case, that means it'll be, you know, social distancing, a mask, you know, all those protocols in place, or they can choose to have a virtual proctor, correct?
That's not, well, the remote virtual proctoring, it may not be a given. I can tell you that in the December exam, it was rather iffy moving into that, and they did not make that decision until a couple months before the exam. So with COVID, it was an accommodation that was made because of COVID. And I'm not certain, I don't know if either of you have any further information, but Jamar said, we haven't made that decision yet if we're going to do the remote proctoring. So from that, I'm taking that that's kind of a, the issue is that the accreditation organization doesn't approve of remote proctoring at this time. They're heading that way, but they don't. So it has to be, ASAE has been dealing with that as a special accommodation.
That is fascinating. So I had not heard that. It looks like my colleagues hadn't either. So for folks who are listening and participating, so as they're thinking through this next test cycle, in all likelihood, they would be going to a Scantron licensed facility.
Yes.
And so just kind of thinking through, they're going to be on a different computer, not their normal home computer, right? They're going to be at the locations computer, and they're going to have kind of the appropriate gear. So they're going to be wearing a face mask the whole time. What are some other things about that test environment that you think they need to be aware of?
I would suggest that, first of all, you can't have any paper. Theoretically, in the Scantron centers, they have a whiteboard, a small whiteboard that you can use with a marker that you can use to write things down on, but that's it. On the actual computer itself, there's an area for notes that if you want to just jot down a note, you can do that. Plus, there's a clock on the computer as well if you want to track where you are in the exam. In the actual exam itself, you have to do the first 100 questions. You cannot take a break. So you have to sit and do 100 questions, submit those, then you can take a 15-minute break max. And then you have the rest of the remaining time to finish the last 100 questions. So if you take too long in the first 100, you're going to have to move at a pretty fast pace in the second 100. So that whole piece of taking breaks and you know, being able to circle keywords and all that kind of stuff is all gone. So you really want to have a practice on taking an exam online in order to just know what you're going to face. The fatigue that your eyes deal with after 4 hours of staring at a screen in fluorescent lighting is really hard on the eyes. So you do need to be aware of that fatigue factor. The other thing with the test environment is that you got people in that room that are taking other exams. And so the exam that the person sitting next to you might only be a 75 question thing, and all of a sudden they're getting up. And if you misunderstand and think they're taking a 200 question exam, they're not. And so there's disruption in the room, people moving around when they finish their specific exam, and that creates some issues for some people.
Yeah, that is super helpful. Let me just check in with Mark or Wendy, see if they have anything. It looks like Wendy has something to add.
It is the most mundane thing, but I actually have candidates that have stayed in a hotel room near the testing site the night before just to keep their stress level down. If you've ever driven through Atlanta, Georgia, and that's where the vast majority of our candidates are taking their exams, traffic is not something to take lightly. So considering what do you need to do in order to be as prepared as possible to go in to the Scantron Center and take the exam with the least amount of stress that from the outside. You know, what can you do? And I know you're going to talk in a minute about how to be nice to yourself the couple of days before, but I do want to stress, you know, if you need to get a hotel room to keep traffic off your worry list, do it.
Yeah, let me just check in with Mark and then we'll talk about that self-care stuff.
The only other thing that I would add to this is to underscore the current protocols relative to masks. I talked to a couple of people who took the exam this past December, who both noted they didn't realize the distraction of having a mask on for 4 hours or however long it took them. One specifically said, I took my practice exams online with a mask on just to prep for it. The other person didn't do that, just assumed, well, I'll wear the mask. And I just didn't think about the fact that in and of itself creates a whole nother level of disruption that we're just not used to. Most of us, how often are you actually wearing a mask for 4 hours straight?
Yeah.
So
especially if you wear glasses, it's 10 times worse.
Right. Donna, there's one other thing I want to just mention and that is during that 4 hour period, you can't have your phone. And for people whose phone is an appendage, being without your phone for 4 hours you can go through withdrawal. And so to practice being 4 hours without your phone at the end of your hand might be an important thing to do, because if you start wondering who's been calling you while you're stuck in this room, that's not going to be helpful.
Great point.
Most days I'd like to give my phone away, so that's fascinating. Okay, I'm just teasing. Okay, so we talked a bit about what they can expect like during the exam, but let's just touch on that. Anything that we haven't mentioned just about kind of self-care, you want to just kind of round robin that real quick?
Don't plan on going back to work after you're done.
Pay attention to what you eat before you take your exam. You need to eat something that will sustain you for a 4 hour period, and a donut and a cup of coffee is not going to do that. So you really want to know what you need to eat and how much sleep you need to be at your best.
And are they getting good instructions about what they're allowed to take with them for break? Like, you know, water, you know, is all that provided from the test facility? What can they expect?
Yeah, Scantron tells you what you can do with that. But there's a locker in the test centers. There's a locker and you can put things in the locker. You have to put if you're carrying a purse, you cannot take a watch into the test area. And I mean, you really can't take, I think you might be able to have a bottle of water, but I'm not sure about that. You want to check that out. But other than that, if you're going to have a snack, you do it during your break, and you probably need to step outside or somewhere in the waiting room. And then you got to wear a mask though, so you really can't eat.
Right. Anything to add to that?
I was just going to say one of my past chairs actually made a great point of plan something fun for yourself after you're finished with the exam, echoing what Mark said about do not plan to go back to work and put in another half day. Your brain is going, just for the very nature of 4 hours of really deep thought and consideration, you're going to be fatigued. So, you know, plan something fun and, you know, pre-COVID, we'd say, go have a margarita with your friend, go to a movie. Think of something more safe than that, perhaps right now, but do something for yourself and being patient with yourself. You know, don't say you're going to go throw a party at your kid's school that afternoon, because that's just not reasonable in the expectation land.
Yeah, one other thing to keep in mind is that you can choose now whether you take the exam in the morning or the afternoon. It used to be everybody had to do it at 9 o'clock in the morning, and you have choices now about that. And you also have choices about how far into the month you want to take it. So the exam is available over a 2-week period. So you can choose, but you got to be early in your choices, because the test centers only have so many slots. So if you really want to have your first choice, you want to register for the exam early enough so you get your first choice.
Yeah, that's a good point, especially if somebody's a morning person or not, definitely not a morning person, that may really impact. Okay, we're going to hammer through some of the just kind of quick questions that folks have put in the chat. And there's quite a few just about resources. So we have a question here from Wendy asking, is the fifth law book, the fifth edition of the law book okay, or do you need the newest edition? Somebody has commented that fifth is fine. And somebody else thought maybe you could download updates. What do you guys have to say about the law book?
I honestly don't think you have to read it. I think there are a few things that you do need to know about the law, but to read the whole book is not necessary for it. It's great for when you are a CSE and you are practicing daily, but for the actual exam, I don't think you need it.
Okay, so difference of perspective, because Wendy finds that one valuable, right, Wendy?
I find it valuable, again, because I am a practicing chief staff officer.
Yep.
I
so
think it's more important. It's more important to know when to call your attorney for the purposes of the exam.
Sure.
It's really important to know when you need to call your attorney. But to know the aspects of the law is, because it's a judgment exam, it's the details of the law are not going to be, those are more factoid questions that you're not going to have on the actual exam.
Okay, think about this.
From a couple of recent candidates is that the having the most current edition isn't critical unless your study group is using it for reference, and then trying to do the cross tabulation can be difficult if you don't have it. But content wise, you don't need to have the most current edition.
Do you need the most current edition of the PPAM book?
When it's available.
What's the status of that? Quick.
Yeah, good. We're waiting. We've been waiting for 2 months now. So the new PPAM book is a very different book than PPAM 3. The actual content outline is very different. And specifically in areas of the difference is in strategic space, there's a whole area of foresight works that is part of, or the duty of foresight, I should say, is part of the new content outline. You can get the Foresight Works user guide off of ASAE's website. If you don't have the 4th edition, that could be helpful to you so you know what it is and how you might use it. The major thing that's different between the two is the diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is a major underlying focus in all of the chapters. So even in membership, there's a whole thing on stakeholder identification and management. Well, we used to think that stakeholders were the vendors, right? The suppliers. Now stakeholders are considered to be those people that are impacted by what the association does, but they don't have access. They've never had access or been able to access your association to get involved. So the whole idea of marketing and finding and reaching those people is a very different aspect to the new book. And so DEI as an underlying value in every single domain makes it really different.
Okay. So I'm going to jump in now and just kind of call that the 4th edition is important. So people listening, if you've got the 3rd edition, I'm sorry, you probably need to get the 4th edition. We have a question about, hey, does anybody know if the Wily test is still available? Anybody have a perspective on that? The Wily sample test, anybody on that?
All I know is that ASAE and Wily have parted ways.
So it may be outdated if it's available. Okay, we're going to move on. Got a question in the chat about the flashcards. MSAE is the producer of those flashcards. Of course, Sue, you are the editor of the flashcards. Let me just tell the group in case they don't know. Yeah, the flashcards are fantastic. I basically credit passing my CAE by reading them to myself on a voice recorder. Hey, this was a long time ago. And then playing them back to myself during commute. But I will tell you, it's 400 flashcards. So it's no joke. That's a lot of flashcards. So happy to answer more of that offline if they have questions about that. So let's, did get a question about, hey, are you offering credit for this session? And the reason why so I should tell you, MSA is an approved provider. So you could use discretion. We did not bill it as a free credit because we're not technically covering any of the domain areas of the CAE. So that's probably something for you to think about, right? All right, so let's see here. We have a good comment that I'm sure they've seen it, but somebody said they've done 50 hours in the last 11 months and only spent $99. A lot of that has to do with the ASAE's conference, right, being virtual and free. And so that's just a reminder to folks that, boy, now is a time, probably more than ever before, where they can get some great content. Understanding that ASAE has expectations about how much of that learning is self-study versus how much of your learning is actually live and interactive. So you need to pay attention to that because ASAE will know, right? Like they know the deal. Okay, so let's, Wendy, I'm going to invite you to look at the chat with me. Sorry, and just make sure I haven't kind of missed anything. Same with you, Kate. I know you're helping in the background.
Yeah, happy to lurk. There is a question regarding the addition of PPAM. How frequently do they come out with new ones? And if somebody does the fourth one, is it going to be outdated next year?
No. Okay, so there are several comments about PPAM 3 too. So PPAM 3 right now on the ASAE website is the authoritative literature for the exam. And the reason that it is because PPAM 4 has not yet been totally released. So I will tell you on PPAM 3 specifically, domains 6, 7, and 8 are pretty similar between the two, the two books, pretty similar. They're pretty much the same authors. Where it really starts to diverge is in the executive leadership, in organizational strategy, and governance. Governance is good, but there's a lot more information in PPAM 4. So if you got PPAM 3, you probably will be okay, but make sure you pick up the Foresight Works piece, okay? The second thing, so the PPAM book is released every 5 years. It's updated, just like the content outline. So the content outline came out in March of 2020. The PPAM book edition 4 was completed, and it was supposed to be out in late January. There was a problem with shipping. So if you buy the PPAM 4 book, it's going to carry you. It's an excellent book. It's a really excellent book, and it covers a lot of other things other than what was in PPAM 3. So I do recommend it. It is available on Kindle right now. ASAE was going to publish a limited supply of paperback copies, which still haven't been received. We're still waiting for that. And then the hardcover was supposed to come out mid-month March. So I have no idea where we are with that right now. People are quite upset though inside ASAE because they haven't been received. But that book will not be revised again until 2025.
So it's safe for purchase for them. They've got some time. Okay, so we're actually we're a couple minutes past our time, so we're going to wind things down right now. I want to do a couple. Wendy, do you want to comment on what's in the chat?
I did want to comment on what's in the chat, and I apologize. I'm actually friends on Facebook with Deirdre Reed, so I see when she has posted her blog, and so I put a sample that'll take you to her blog. That's the direct link for the Association Brain Food Weekly that she's been doing for several years, and it may be coming out a little less often right now. But again, the sample's in the chat, and we'll send it back out to y'all. And once I'm no longer on camera, I'll go get a really pretty link for you guys. But I did want to mention that, sorry about that. It's not an actual Facebook group. I was wrong.
Well, and her blog is excellent anyway.
I mean, so good. It's so good.
I enjoy her blog.
Follow her anyway. Right?
Completely agree. Okay, so a couple things at the same time. So we've already committed. We're going to comb through the chat. We're going to summarize this. It will be included with the recording. To my colleagues from other state societies who've hung in there, please now post in the chat a link to any of the preparation kind of programs, kind of stuff that you have, just so that, and what state you're in, so that when we compile it, it makes for easy compilation, and the participants can kind of file through it when we send it to them. Now, for closing remarks, as we wind things down, I talked to the panelists ahead of time, and they knew this question was coming, so I'm sure they have really fantastic, pithy answers. Here's the question. If your best friend was preparing to sit for the CAE exam and you could only share one piece of advice with them, what would it be? I'm going to start with Mark.
For the exam itself, practice. this is not just going to come naturally to us. I mentioned at the onset of this, when's the last time any of us took a 200 question multiple choice exam? Practice, 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 and relax.
Great advice. Sue, how about you?
You have to learn how to dissect the questions. Learn how to read the darn question, how to pull apart the answer options, and it really comes down to some of the grammar. You got to notice the verbs and the adjectives and the adverbs, because they are all qualifiers and indicate nuances.
Well, that sounds like a good time, doesn't it? Wendy, what's your one piece of advice?
Take a good hard look at what you know and what you don't know. You cannot have an overinflated view of your own knowledge and experience. You really do need to take the self-assessments very, very seriously. If you're not a financial genius, don't skip it just because you don't like math from the standpoint of financial statements and whatnot. Really take seriously recognizing your own skills gaps and making a plan to address it.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And really using the sample tests that are out there as kind of formative assessment, right? So they can assess where they need to go back and continue their study and focus. Okay, that is absolutely fantastic. I want to thank all of you, Wendy and Mark and Sue, for just super informative information today. Also want to thank the participants and of course our colleagues from other state societies and some of the study group chairs who have participated and really shared great information via the chat. We're very, very grateful for you. And just to kind of recapture for folks, within a week, you'll get the video to this, you'll have access to the video, and you'll also have access to a summary of the resources and handouts. So definitely appreciate your participation. Glad that you were able to join us today. Be safe, and we'll look forward to maybe seeing you again sometime very, very soon.